In February 2022, Russian missiles rained down on Ukrainian cities and tanks rolled towards Kyiv to end Ukrainian independent statehood. President Zelensky declined a Western evacuation offer, and Ukrainians rallied to defend their country. But what are the roots of this war, which has upended the international legal order and brought back the spectre of nuclear escalation? How did these supposedly brotherly peoples become each other's worst nightmare? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and definitely comment to help people discover the amazing guests that we feature. Also, do please check out the validated Ukrainian charities in the description of the video. It has never been more important, as it is now, to support Ukraine to stay resilient and to stay in the fight. Well, let's get into the questions. So if we start with the book, I find it absolutely fascinating. And I think I need to go back and reread definitely certain parts to get all the nuances. But let's start with the identity debates and entangled histories, which is at the heart of the book. Now, this seems to very much relate back to origin stories. And in some ways, mythologizing or weaponizing of origin stories and a diverging sense of the origin story of Kyiv and Moscow's own origin story of its empire and identity. Oksana, what's your thoughts on that? If we go back to deep history and the mythologizing of that history.
I think the mythologizing part is very important, as you said, because basically it's not so much about the historical facts, because the facts sometimes, especially the further back in history you go, maybe unknown, contested. Historians would debate what actually happened. But how the history is narrated is really matters, because basically this history could be narrated, broadly speaking, in two ways. One which would emphasize, and this has been the narration done by imperial Russia, by the Soviet Union, and increasingly in the post-Soviet period as well, and certainly by Putin, that there has been this always organic existential unity between Russia and Ukraine. So the two were destined to be together. They were together from the time immemorial. And whenever there were some sort of attempted separation, these were either meddling by hostile powers or by some kind of traitors to the common cause. And that's essentially has been the narration. And, we can pick elements in history going, 16th century battles, events, political actors like Mazepa of, 1700s, who betrayed, quote unquote, the Russian Tsar with the Swedes, right? But then another way to look at this common history would be to say, well, there were periods in history when there were attempts by political elites and population at that time Ukrainian territories to achieve some kind of political autonomy. And these attempts were repeatedly crushed by the imperial center, in particular by Russia. And that's how essentially Ukrainian elites in the post-Soviet period decided to narrate this history, to emphasize that there has been both Ukrainian nation and attempts at Ukrainian statehood. And basically there were events in history to support that type of narration and interpretation. And these narratives increasingly clashed. So that's exactly kind of the weaponization of history comes in. So in our book, we talk about, in the historical chapter, not so much about kind of what is the correct way of looking at things, but there are these two different ways of narrating common past, and that leads to different implications for today. Are Ukraine and Russia separate states, or is the separation somehow unnatural and they have to reunite? That's exactly what Putin wants to do, and he uses history for that argument. And of course, Ukrainians reject that.
And Maria, this is such an important point here, diverging origin stories. And, that could be seen as a purely sort of local phenomenon, but actually it's blowing up into a big geopolitical issue. How misunderstood are the roots of the war if we're talking about sort of, origin stories, colonialism, etc., being a key part of it?
Absolutely, there's a lot of misunderstanding going around. A lot of people outside of Russia and Ukraine, in Europe, in North America, do perceive Russia and Ukraine as sort of separated at the hip, brotherly peoples. They belong together. You very often hear this this as some sort of justification for why, you know, maybe it's not so bad if Russia reimposes control over Ukraine. How are they so different? But in fact, I think it's important for people to recognize that even if there is a significant entanglement in history, the current moment is a moment in which the Ukrainian nation has chosen one particular interpretation of its past, has committed in significant numbers and proportion, overwhelmingly has committed to this distinctive identity. We show in the book exactly how over the past 30 years, we've seen really a growing proportion of the Ukrainian population at this point, overwhelming majority, committing to the distinctive identity conception. So it doesn't really, in some ways, it doesn't matter what the entanglement was in earlier periods. The fact is that right now, Ukrainians want to be separate and are fighting to continue to be separate.
And I think that there's a risk of simplification, isn't there? And I think I'll put my hand up to an extent, you know, on the channel, we do this as well. We tend to look at things and it's simplistic. And of course, the need to unite and be resilient will lead people to perhaps take sort of, you know, a more coherent but simplification of certain things. And one of these narratives is the simple one, colonization versus decolonization. So Ukraine is colonized by Russia, and the current process we're seeing is a reversal of that, and that's what the war is all about. Oksana, is it much more complex than that, or is this quite a useful framework with which to see events?
I think actually it's a useful framework with which to see events. What I would say to this, I think it highlights that colonization can take quite different forms. Like not all forms of colonialism look the same. Because those who would object to the framing of Ukrainian-Russian previous relations as some form of colonial relations would say, well, but what about in the Soviet Union? The Soviet state promoted Ukrainian language and other minority languages. There was this policy of nativization that Lenin started and that Stalin, reverses but never fully abandons. And as Putin says, Lenin creates Ukraine, right? Like that's basically, how can you say that's a colonial relationship? But of course, in reality, not only Lenin didn't create Ukraine, but this policy of, say, promotion of Ukrainian language that starts in the 1920s starts in response to Ukrainian national movement that fought the Bolsheviks for independent statehood, that didn't succeed in this, but Bolsheviks realized the importance and the strength of this Ukrainian identity and this movement for sovereignty, and basically gave this as a concession. Right, so that was the way, and that came accompanied by various repressive measures, including famine of the 1932-33 that killed millions of Ukrainians, ultimately, deportations of people who expressed quote unquote wrong kind of nationalism and things like this. So I think the colonial, it is appropriate to say that, that's actually gives us some leverage of understanding the current moment, with a caveat that colonialism of, say, a Soviet state looked quite different than, say, colonialism of Western powers, and that's also important.
And Maria, if we look at this from the eyes of external people, I mean, I've been to now numerous events in London run by various institutions, one being the Ukrainian Institute in London, incredibly active. And you just know when it comes to the Q&A part, you're going to get problematic questions. And I can just see the body language and the tension and the frustration in many of the Ukrainians in the audience and on the stage, hearing the same, I would say, weaponized narratives and delusions coming up. And of course, one of these is that there's more similarity than difference. Ukrainians, Russians, same thing, really. I mean, it comes up over and over again. Even people who are immersed in Ukraine's story and are ostensibly pro-Ukrainian, I've heard extremely problematic things from them. I won't, give any names here, but one of those is, well, East and West, and the assumption that Russian language, even being ethnically Russian historically, therefore means you want to be Russian in terms of a political overlord or structure or whatever. And there's some incredibly problematic assumptions here, which of course Russian propaganda utilizes mercilessly. So could we talk about the sort of complexities around identity in that respect?
Yeah, it's interesting because the language issue would be so easy to understand if people just looked outside of the Russia-Ukraine comparison. I'm Canadian and we speak English and we have an entangled history with the US. We have some disagreements on interpreting certain parts of our common history. The War of 1812, very differently taught in Canada and in the US. But no one would say, well, then it must be okay for the US to impose control over Canada, to have an opinion about Canada's domestic policies, or think about, the British Empire. Should Britain have opinions over Canadian domestic policies and US domestic policies because of the previous entanglement? I mean, it's a very easy thing to dispel the moment you look outside of the Russia-Ukraine context. So it's very strange that people tend to not see this very obvious problem there. But I think even if we zoom in on the Russia-Ukraine issue, I think the last 2 years have really demonstrated gradually, quite clearly for people, that there is no division in terms of that the categories of ethnic Russian speaker are not meaningful in the way that people originally thought. The fact that we have all these Russian speaking areas that were liberated by the Ukrainian army and greeted the liberating Ukrainian army with open arms in Russian often. And we have all these, of course, Russian speaking soldiers fighting the Russian invaders. We have old ladies pointing out to the Russian invaders in Russian that they're not welcome. I think it has had the effect of illustrating for a broader audience how the Russian speaker, Ukrainian speaker dichotomy really does not work, and the Russian propaganda attempt, I think, has largely failed, which is why they're sort of bringing it up a bit less often. I mean, it made me think that even to some extent, it was really interesting that Putin the I think it was in the interview with Tucker Carlson, brought up this example of these Russian-speaking Ukrainian soldiers, fighting and shooting at the Russian invaders, and they were both speaking Russian, he said, and he said it in some sort of way in which he thought that he was illustrating a point, that this is a senseless war, and why were they fighting each other? But in fact, he really just made the point that yes, Russian-speaking Ukrainians don't want you there as well. It's quite striking that he chose to bring that up when, in fact, it really goes against his propaganda.
Another one of these sort of conceptions could be here, and I think this is false, but that a certain style of Lvovian nationalism has crept eastwards. It's infected good Russians, and of course, when you listen to the propagandists talking about it, what they're talking about is a disease. I mean, in their terms, it's a sort of mental disease, an aberration. Um, in reality, is this a far more complex process than a West-East transition of values? How should we be thinking about this as part of a multi-layered process, Oksana?
Yes, I think the way we actually, this is a very good question, and it I think brings the importance of maybe I'll introduce a little bit of like an academic perspective here of the so-called constructivist studies of nationalism, because in scholarship, nationalism and national identity is understood as a process that is of continued social and political construction. In other words, scholars would reject that there is such a thing as some sort of like objective identity or biological or God-given, as Putin says, or from, the soul or what have you. And essentially, basically says that people are social creatures and what different identities we embrace are part of and the world we live in, social environment, political environment, education, and all of these features. And of course, what was happening that if we look at it this way, that say in the Soviet period, in the Tsarist period, in Russia today, in the occupied territories today, the state is using the whole weight of its propaganda to teach people certain identity, right? They, for example, trying to re-educate children in these territories that they're really Russian and so forth. And then, of course, once Ukraine became an independent state and this process of, say, looking at history through a different lens began, right? This notion that, people, say, who fought for Ukrainian statehood in the past, they were not all necessarily traitors and bad people, but, they wanted, state sovereignty and things like that. And then, people do change their views. We can see that in this, for example, identification and even in the census data that percent of people who self-identified as Russian in Ukraine drops quite a lot between 1989, the last Soviet census, and 2021, because again, people kind of grew up in a different political environment. They were maybe oftentimes from mixed marriage. They spoke both languages. And in the Soviet period, it was, in various ways prestigious and encouraged and kind of to identify as Russian. That was the way closest to communism, to progress, to better career jobs. And all of this changes once Ukraine becomes an independent state. And again, more people begin to embrace this notion that Ukrainians are distinct people and deserve their own state. And that's something Putin does not like, because it basically goes against his political agenda, cultural agenda, but he tries to couch it that this is somehow unnatural. But scholars would say it's actually very natural. These are the processes that happen all over the world. This is how modern European nations came to be at the age of, nationalism. But there is no kind of way to engage in this analysis with somebody who insists that there is like an objective that Ukrainians are somehow like objectively Russian, and any deviation from it is Western meddling or enemies or brainwashing or you name it. So that's basically, I think, the way to understand the spread of this stronger Ukrainian identity from west to east in Ukraine.
And Maria, to support this, you have a mixture of soft power and, of course, in the full-scale war, we see hard-edged power as well. But if we turn to soft-edged power, which had more of an effect until the full-scale war, how does Russia, let's say, sort of weaponize entertainment, literature, culture, in order to try to cement this idea of singular rather than complex, nationalities and allegiances?
Yeah, for sure. Russia was doing this all along, mainly through Russian media, which in Ukraine up until 2014 was widely watched. So all the propaganda that Russian citizens were getting from TV, Ukrainian citizens were getting mostly as well, because they had access to these TV channels. Russia also had purposeful programs to try to encourage young Ukrainians to go to Russia, to be integrated culturally, to have these programs where they learn that Russian culture is their home, their central sort of sphere within which they belonged. And when you think about Zelensky, for example, obviously he spent a big chunk of his entertainment career both in Russia and in Ukraine, and it was a very sort of smooth transition back and forth between the two contexts. So really, in the cultural sphere, we see that sort of the beginning of the rupture between Russia and Ukraine is the first the first Russian aggression in 2014. This is when the Ukrainian state takes some measures to actually combat Russian propaganda, some proactive measures to do that. And obviously the shock of the initial invasion also has an effect, but it's a very gradual process. And in a lot of ways, it's a process that's driven really by Russian first, heavy-handed pressure and then military aggression. In other words, Ukrainians maintained for a very long time this hope that they will be able to have a good, friendly relationship with Russia as two independent states. We have this data in the book that we discuss where it shows that over time, really Ukrainians for a very long time, even after the 2014 aggression, maintained this hope that Russia and Ukraine will be separate but friendly states. It's only after the full-scale invasion that we see this complete rupture and major rejection, obviously, again, as a result of Russia's actions.
And the next question, we'll start with Oksana, and then we'll move to you. I think this question is going to be relevant to both. Putin, his paranoid worldview, which is now turned into extraordinary aggression against Ukraine, but also we're starting to see the emergence of, dare I say it, a second Red Terror against his own people. But part of the roots of this, obviously his KGB training, and you can argue his childhood and so on, but also he's witnessed multiple revolutions where what he would have seen as the Russian Empire is challenged and disintegrates. First of all, leaving Berlin in united Germany and the fall of Russian influence there. And then secondly, Ukrainian independence. And for his paranoid worldview, this is a fracturing of, first of all, territory of Russian influence, and then secondly, Ukraine, which he seems to believe Russia cannot be complete without that. Ukraine is the straw that broke the back of the USSR by becoming independent, and Russia is somehow not whole without Ukraine. Now, we see this in many of the propagandists' ideas, in many of the sort of fascistic philosophers who are potentially linked with Putin, although I find it dubious the idea that he actually reads those kind of books or understands them. But who buys into this idea that Russia cannot be Russia without Ukraine?
I think this is essentially an imperial idea because, again, just like Ukraine and as a country chooses how to define itself, Russia also has this choice. And in the book, we go over about the 1990s period when there was actually very active debate within Russia as to how to define the nation, what are sort of the true quote-unquote borders of the Russian nation and the Russian state. And there has been a view out there that basically was, in the form of expression, what scholars would call a civic Russian nation, that would basically say that Russia is, citizens of different ethnicities who live in the borders of the Russian state. And this identification between the nation and the state does not have to involve Ukraine, right? So in other words, you are rebuilding, and it was also accompanied oftentimes by democratic understanding of the Russian nation. So there would be this kind of new civic nation at peace with its neighbors, within the borders that it has. And yes, it has interests, as other countries do outside its borders, but it's not trying to think of itself as like a body without an arm, that we have to have these countries back. But for a variety of reasons, this view does not succeed. It's essentially, liberals around Yeltsin to some extent embraced this view. They were probably the main group. There was always kind of minority view. There were nationalists, there were communists who had various other ways for thinking about Russia, much broader than the existing state, including Russian speakers, ethnic Russians abroad, all of the Soviet Union. And that's essentially, with Putin coming to power, this kind of imperial view began more and more dominant. So in other words, that I think Russia had a choice. One could say it might still have this choice in the future to not define itself as impossible to exist without Ukraine, but that's not how Putin chose to define it. And then, of course, now there is this whole war of aggression, which is couched in this almost spiritual terms that, we are restoring what's kind of God-given normal, quote-unquote, order of things. So I think that's an important context.
So, Maria, I'm interested to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll add here that this sort of gradual abandonment, or gradual failure, rather, of the civic Russian nation idea, which happened in the 90s. I think it's important to remember that this is not all Putin's doing. And when we talk about it in the book about the 90s, we point out that really the way in which the Soviet Union collapsed was based on somewhat of a misunderstanding between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian president at the time, Kravchuk, famously called it a civilized divorce, but really that's not how Russian elites saw it. And in fact, if we continue with the stick with the marriage analogy, in some way, they thought of the collapse of the Soviet Union as a rewriting of the vows. As, you know, this way of marriage failed, we're going to figure out a different way in which we're still going to be together. And so, as Oksana pointed out, the proportion of the Russian elites at the time who probably were ready to embrace a non-imperial Russian identity and start building it, were already a minority. And over time in the 90s, as political competition sort of declined in Russia, there was less and less of it. That's also these debates also declined, and basically the majority view of the imperial Russian identity was going to win anyway, regardless of whether Putin was Yeltsin's successor or not. I mean, there's some window of opportunity in the 90s, but it's not very wide open, so to speak, and it's short-lived.
And that raises some interesting ideas about the inevitability of the war. We will come to that one later. I think that's an incredibly important question. But also another misconception here is that, I remember books came out in the 90s that looked at Russian nationalism, the resurgent nationalism, and compared that to, the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Black Hundreds, and all these other kind of nationalist movements within Russian tradition. So we got into the mindset of thinking that sort of imperialism is associated with a particular group, a particular extreme group within society. It's become clearer that actually, until the full-scale war, this was a fairly common view, not just amongst extremists, but also you could get pro-imperial views from liberals, from liberal economists. You could get some very fuzzy views on Russian imperialism, even from some of the most ardent opponents of Putin's vertical system.
Yes, I think here it is exactly, again, the point that this nationalism and kind of imperial nationalism can come in different shades, and it does. And I think it really highlights the importance of absence or presence of democratic competition. Because the views that existed in Russia, it is true that there were, say, this notion of liberal empire, so-called liberal empire that Chubais proposes at some point, a reformer. And the notion there is that Russia would become this kind of attractive, reformed market economy, and these countries on the periphery of Russia would sort of want to integrate with it. Right? So that's not going to be done through the force of arms and tanks like Putin is doing now, but it would basically be a process, kind of voluntary process. So the umbrella is still, the expectation is still, as Maria said, kind of this rewriting of vows, kind of growing closer political ties, some form of potential common polity. But the methods by which it was going to be achieved was quite different. So, of course, there is a big difference between sort of ultra-right, anti-Semitic, say, nationalist wing, and these kind of more liberal notions of like a liberal empire. And we talk about in the book, that's another important part of the story we tell, how this divergence on the regime type was very important, because one counterfactual is, if, say, had democracy survived in Russia after the 1990s, these views would have competed in the public realm, and they would have competed for control of policy, and maybe we wouldn't end up with a full-scale invasion and tanks rolling across the border and bombs dropping, planes dropping bombs, because there would have been disagreement among the Russian political class of how to achieve this integration with Ukraine. So even if they all wanted it, or most of them wanted it, they would have at least disagreed on methods. and that could have been, one way to prevent the war. But once we have consolidation of political power in the hands of essentially one man by now, then these alternative views, even kind of more modest imperial views, are basically out. They don't have the capacity to influence policymaking.
And in addition, if Russia had indeed consolidated sort of a competitive political system, we might have had a situation where it was an attractive center for the former Soviet states, and Ukraine may have wanted to pursue closer ties with a thriving democratic Russia. I mean, that counterfactual is sort of theoretically plausible. I mean, in the book we go over it, and we basically we reach the conclusion that it was possible, but that's not what happened. And in part, that's not what happened because there were a lot of factors going against this happening. But in theory, it's possible.
And let's turn to the revolutions, because this is the interesting phase. And again, there is a conception externally, either a highly propagandized conception that Maidan is a CIA plot, blah, blah, blah. We all heard that one. But even the more moderate interpretation is that Maidan is a local, domestic process, and the Revolution on Granite and the Orange Revolution and a whole series of these fundamental changes. If you flip that on its head, can you also see these as a process of de-Russification, moving away not only the social and political, but also the business model of Ukraine, away from the Russian way of doing business, informal power networks, more mafia, extremely nepotistic and corrupt? And there are progressive attempts to, one, rid Ukraine of Russian ways of doing business, and secondly, provide some resistance to the re-Russification, to the imperial, or the attempt to impose some kind of imperial control over Ukraine. And in that sense, it's a much, much bigger subject than just a local political movement.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to this, in the sense that the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan are definitely sort of progression in Ukraine's development of first a competitive regime and then a better democracy. And because Russia was going in the opposite direction in that same period, we have this widening of an enormous gap that happens between the regime types of Russia and Ukraine in this period. In fact, if you look at all the indices of democratic development in different versions of it: electoral democracy, liberal democracy, involvement of civil society in constraining the state. In all of these different ways of thinking about it, we see a huge gap or a huge divergence opening up between Russia and Ukraine after the Orange Revolution in 2004. And the initial sort of the impetus of the Orange Revolution is, of course, to end the use of manipulated elections. And this is indeed what happens in Ukraine after 2004. We no longer have stolen, manipulated elections as Russia continues to have them. The post-Orange era doesn't actually manage to make huge strides in terms of rule of law and control of corruption, but it does make significant strides in terms of institutionalizing political competition and making sure that all the political players actually realize that competition is going to be there. They're not going to be able to wipe each other out. and end political competition. And after Euromaidan, we see strides in terms of rule of law reforms, anti-corruption reforms. Those have been even enhanced even further after the full-scale invasion, but there was a lot of progress already done in 2014, 2022. And indeed, one of the biggest distinctions that opens up between Russia and Ukraine in that period is that even though some sort of think, well, both countries are corrupt, both countries have oligarchs, in fact, there is a significant difference between Russia and Ukraine. In Russia, the oligarchs are sort of serving at the pleasure of the state. They have their assets only insofar as they pledge allegiance to the regime. And we've seen repeatedly that the Putin regime has been able to destroy oligarchs that try to challenge, or maybe even, even if he thinks that they might be challenging him. Whereas in Ukraine, we have these major asset owners competing with each other. And that sort of lays the groundwork of sustainable political competition for the long haul, which at this point is taken as a given in Ukraine, both by the elites and by the electorate.
Yeah, Maria gave a very comprehensive answer. I'll just emphasize one thing, that these cycles of protest in Ukraine were basically where autocrats were overthrown, and that's especially the case in 2004 and 2014. I think Putin has been so determined to spin these events as some sort of Western ploy, CIA plot, and or extreme nationalists and so forth, because also of a potential precedent that it creates for Russia. It didn't create this precedent, but it is, logical thinking would say it could, because if you have this narrative that there are these Ukrainians and Russians who are so similar, that essentially identical, brotherly, so forth, and then here is this country that is very similar to ours, right? These people, and they can overthrow an autocrat, and all of the police force and security services and propaganda in the media is not enough to prevent it. Like, that's a very dangerous thing, right? So I don't think that would be the only reason, because all of these things was the oligarchs and political competition and kind of different ways of doing business. All of this is true, but I think, and this especially probably would be the case for 2004, arguably maybe somewhat less the case in 2014, but still there. That's why I think this complete rejection in Putin's Russia of the idea that this was really domestic political process in Ukraine that created it, and not some CIA meddling or Victoria Nuland's cookies or any number of these other external things.
And let's continue, Oksana, with that thought. Has Ukraine therefore created a template for rolling back or halting and rolling back autocracy, methodologies to fight tyranny, which of course are terrifying for someone like Putin, and of course for the leadership in China? They hate that idea. But Ukraine seems to be going further and finding methodologies to fight creeping oligarchy. Now that's threatening not just to autocrats, that's threatening to certain politicians who see advantage in oligarchy in the West, in the US, Britain, and Europe. Could this be one of the reasons behind the hesitancy, perhaps, to fully support Ukrainian victory? The innovations that are happening, the political innovations in Ukraine, are not threatening to Putin alone.
I don't know, just, that's kind of the first time somebody poses this particular question. My first instinct is to say that I don't think that's the reason why there is some hesitancy, because in a way, the way Ukraine has managed to preserve and increase political competition and curb the interests of the oligarchs are not ultimately that new, because the two kind of main driving forces here, one is the strength of civil society, and that's very important, and that we see that in Eastern Europe in earlier, decades, from the overthrowing of communism to ultimately, again, preventing wannabe autocrats to consolidate power. And Ukrainian civil society has been strong and only gotten stronger over the years. And another important, again, driving mechanism, which is also not kind of Ukraine specific, is the influence and the role of the EU and kind of Western integration with the Western institutions, because it creates this appealing goal, right, the carrot, if you will, and then certain standards need to be met to get these benefits. So in order to join the EU, you have to, pursue certain reforms, and these reforms may be opposed by domestic power holders and entrenched corrupt officials and so forth. But then again, the society and the electorate is pushing towards it, and we've seen this, greater democratization in East Central Europe, as on the way to the EU. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessarily kind of novel set of strategies. And of course, we can add to this independent media, investigative journalism, right, plurality of views, all of these things, the judiciary that would be less corrupt and not subject to it. So my sense is that it's, that the hesitancy in the West, in some quarters of the West, to support Ukraine's victory is not because Ukraine invented some sort of silver bullet against Western corrupt officials and elites. But I wonder if Maria would agree or not. I don't think we got that question.
I agree. But I think there is something to be said that for the fact that the oligarchic Russian money that is in the West does act. I don't think it's a conscious decision not to help Ukraine, but the fact that all these business relationships have developed and Russian money is in the West makes it harder to really sever economic relations with Russia and institute the type of economic sanctions that will be really debilitating. And I think to some extent, the West has been sort of hesitant there, but not necessarily in a, I think not in a conscious way, but it has made it harder to really hurt the Russian economy effectively.
And I'm sure we could talk for many hours, because your book is a mine of ideas. But the last question, I think, addresses two of the more interesting sort of aspects of the book and some of the sort of concluding chapters, and that is about the idea of the full-scale invasion somehow having a certain inevitability about it. That, a lot of people didn't predict it, in fact. But when you go back and look at historical patterns, is it a conflict that was bound to happen in the end? And there have been some voices. For instance, Dzhokhar Dudayev made an extraordinarily prophetic speech where he basically said that Russia would continue to reimpose imperial dominance across its near abroad until it got to Ukraine. And Ukraine would be the point, like the manufacture of iron in a star, which just kills this process and destroys Russian imperialism. Now, that may not have happened, but what is your sense from your research of the sort of inevitability of not just this clash, but the scale of clash that we are seeing? Let's start with Oksana, and then we'll go to Maria.
Okay. Yes, I would like to say that it is the way we think about the argument we make in the book. It is not kind of inevitability in this deterministic way, meaning that it was preordained, back in either 91 or, whenever Russian Empire was first formed. What we do say that there have been this process of increasing divergence on these important dimensions, especially on identity and the regime type, and that of various ways that Russia increasingly tried to bring Ukraine back into the so-called fold into the Russian world. And as these means were failing, the methods were escalated. And potentially this, so again, the decision to invade was Putin's and Putin's alone. In that sense, we would not say that, this specific decision had to be taken at the time that they did. But given the Ukraine increasingly pulling away and Russia increasingly determined to bring it back into the fold, and ways to achieve it without full-scale invasion failed, the last of which being this Minsk peace process, which, as we describe in the book, was kind of a Trojan horse that Putin wanted Ukraine to sign on to, whereby these separatist, Russia-controlled separatist areas would essentially have a veto power over Ukrainian domestic political, and not just foreign, but also domestic political development. And that would have been vassalization of Ukraine by peaceful means in a way, right? But that doesn't work because Ukrainian elites reject it and society also understands the danger of it. Then, Putin sort of throws the towel and goes for the full-scale invasion. But again, there were contingencies along the way. So had Russia retained a degree of political competition, right, invasion may have been avoided. Had, for example, Yanukovych succeeded in crushing Euromaidan and stayed in power, he could have potentially delivered Ukraine to Russia without the need for Russia to invade, right? So in that sense, our story is that not the invasion was inevitable in this deterministic way, but if we actually look at the way political process developed and this divergence increased, then the invasion became increasingly more likely.
Absolutely. I think I would add here that I think what our book does is identify certain points at which conflict became less or more likely. And also we try to identify some of the contingencies where conflict or where this full-scale invasion might have been avoided, and those contingencies, we argue, are quite different than some of the other contingencies brought up in sort of public discourse. So, for example, whereas Mearsheimer and the people who buy his argument would say, well, had NATO never expanded, this conflict wouldn't have happened. We argue sort of the opposite, that had it been possible for Ukraine to enter NATO earlier, and enter at some point, conflict would have been avoided because Russia would have been deterred. Had the West stepped up a deterrence containment policy after 2014, maybe Russia would have been deterred from the full-scale invasion, as opposed to the argument made by some, well, had Ukraine been forced to implement Minsk, we wouldn't have the invasion. We basically argued the opposite. If Ukraine had been forced to implement Minsk, that would have been a de facto establishing of Russian control over Ukraine. So it would have avoided the war by delivering capitulation by Ukraine to Russia's interests. So I think what the book does is sort of offer some contingencies which are very different from the ones that others have brought up. But ultimately, up until the very last moment, Putin could have decided not to pursue this, could have decided against a full-scale invasion, and could have stuck with more pressure, more patience, more strategic patience, so to speak. So ultimately, it's not inevitable that the full-scale invasion happened.
And there's another track, isn't there, of Putin's internal politics, the reliance on outsourcing the sort of these imperialist adventures to people like Gherkin and so on. One could almost say that is innovations in terror, innovations in imperialism. But that also perhaps was creating a track of escalation that made it more and more likely that he couldn't get out of that track. So you've got this internal politics, and I guess this is the last question. How important is the lack of an inheritance mechanism within the Russian political system, the lack of competition, the lack of any kind of mechanism to transfer power, plus this increasing reliance on extreme forces and innovators in terror, like Gherkin and Prigozhin? Is that also a track of increasing, not inevitability, but increasing probability of where we ended up?
Well, I would say that the personification of power that we see with Putin certainly increases this. Basically, the invasion was his decision. By all accounts, even his closest associates seem to have been surprised that that was, the decision made. And of course, that kind of policymaking can only occur in a highly authoritarian setting where the dear leader holds absolute power, right? And then, so in that sense, yes, I think it may probably explain kind of the timing, because he decided when he decided and so forth. But again, the story that we tell in the book of this kind of broader divergence gives the context within which this decision was taken. And then, on your kind of the first part of your question, I would just say a couple of words on the succession. I think that's definitely an issue for all autocrats, this extreme autocracies, that the problem of succession is great because institutions basically are not functioning as they intended, right? The parliament, all of these are just rubber stamping, so which creates great uncertainty. And the stakes are so much higher, right? Because nobody is really safe. Like if in Ukraine, the oligarchs who may not support the government, there is another party that they can affiliate themselves with, parties that may change position in elections, somebody who wins loses. None of this is this institutional kind of certainty and rules apply to Russia, which I think does create, especially in the West, the fear that like if Russia loses, what then happens, right? That would be, you can spin any kind of fantastic scenario, disintegration, nuclear weapons proliferation. And I think that's a separate conversation how likely any of these outcomes is. But I think it does create this great uncertainty about what might come after this kind of autocrat that Putin has become, which in turn I think creates fears that we can't sort of rock that boat too much, because whatever comes next may be even worse.
And the last word to you, Maria, on that subject.
Yeah, for sure. It's the lack of a mechanism for Putin to imagine how he could step down does make him sort of a one-track politician, where he has to keep going to make sure that his hold on power is cemented, and a lot of the decisions come from there. But I think it's also important to not go into the track of saying, well, he launched this war only because he wanted to make sure that he stays in power. Because I think what our argument does is explain how the divergence between Russia and Ukraine, which was so significant and growing bigger with each passing year, basically put him in a position where if he wanted this divergence bridged, he would have had to escalate the methods to achieve it. So in that sense, this collision course was probably going to lead to this conflict, absent a significant deterrent capability by Ukraine. The logic of this divergence between Russia and Ukraine kind of sets things up for a collision.
Well, thank you both so much, not just for your incredible book and all the ideas that come from that. Thank you also for sharing those with the channel and making the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for the invitation.